proceedings with recitation from the Holy Quran. Answer, please.
शुरू अल्लाह का नाम लेकर जो बड़ा मेहरबान निहायत रहम वाला है। ऐ नबी सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम, हमने तुमको कौसर यानी बहुत ज्यादा भलाई अता फरमाई है। तो अपने परवरदिगार के लिए नमाज पढ़ा करो और कुर्बानी किया करो। कुछ शक नहीं कि तुम्हारा दुश्मन ही बेनाम रहेगा।
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Distinguished speakers and participants, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. On behalf of Ambassador Khalid Mahmood, Chairman Board of Governors, and Ambassador Azaz Ahmed Chaudhary, Director General Institute of Study Islamabad, I warmly welcome you all at today's webinar. This webinar is organized by the Arms Control and Disarmament Center at the Institute on a very important subject, that is shifting Indian nuclear doctrine, implications for regional stability. Ladies and gentlemen, as we all know that the use of nuclear weapons will bring catastrophic consequences. Therefore, keeping in mind this inherent danger associated with the use of nuclear weapons, states have adopted different weapon use policies, including the defensive use or the no first use policy. And it's important to note that China is the first country who adopted the NFU policy in 1964, and it is still following it. However, in the South Asian context, in 1999, India adopted the no first use policy, but its vagueness and ambiguity continues. Since then, the Indian officials and nuclear experts have been debating to review India's credible minimum deterrence doctrine and criticizing the effectiveness of its no first use policy with the attitude that why India should bind itself to no first use policy, said by Manohar Parrikar. And more recently, Rajnath Singh said that what happens in future depends on the circumstances. So distinguished participants, in this regard, recent developments indicate that India is abandoning its so-called NFU with a more aggressive policy of first use or preemptive counterforce strike, and developing a new and advanced nuclear weapons program, as well as modern delivery capabilities. According to the latest CIPRI estimates, with a growing arsenal of 150 nuclear weapons, India is expanding the size of its nuclear weapons stockpiles and infrastructure for producing nuclear warheads. Such transformations in the Indian nuclear doctrine and force posture will bring severe implications for regional peace and deterrent stability. It will introduce further instability by generating an open-ended arms race. It will increase nuclear force alert and readiness status, which will enhance the chances of accidental or unauthorized use, and any miscalculation will provide no time and chance to avoid a nuclear exchange within the region. So keeping in mind these concerns, the Arms Control and Disarmament Center has organized this webinar to explore, number one, what is the likely shift regarding the NFU policy in the Indian nuclear doctrine, and what would be its nature and impact on the Indian nuclear force posture. What are the implications for regional nuclear deterrent stability? What kind of threats, first use or counter-force preemption or any other, does it pose to Pakistan security? And finally, what are the possible options for Pakistan to restore regional deterrent stability if India disturbs it? For that purpose, we have invited national and international experts to share their thoughts on this very important subject. So with this, we will now begin our formal proceeding. I will invite Ms. Ghazala Yasmin, Research Fellow at the ACDC-ISSI, to give a briefing on webinar subject. Ghazala, over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning to everyone. As already mentioned by Qasim, Indian nuclear doctrine has been going through a transformation, and there has been debate in academic circles over abandoning the no first use policy. Statements from policy-making circles also support the notion that India is abandoning its NFU. As recently as August 16, 2019, the Indian Defense Minister Rajnath Singh made a statement on India's NFU policy, saying it has been adhered to so far, but what happens in the future depends on the circumstances. So India's commitment to no first use was always shaky, I believe, and Pakistan has never taken it seriously. However, now the issue goes beyond NFU. Indian doctrine is not only moving towards abandoning NFU, but there are indications that it's moving towards a policy of nuclear preemption against Pakistan. Evidence also suggests that India seems to be developing a nuclear arsenal that goes beyond its policies of credible deterrence and NFU. Pronouncements from former Indian defense officials and corresponding pursuit of enhanced nuclear capabilities reveals that a strategy of preemptive counter-force strike against Pakistan in a crisis. India has been investing in new precision weaponry as well as space-based and ground-based surveillance, intelligence, and reconnaissance capabilities that would support any such move towards first use or preemption. India has developed a number of short and medium-range missiles that would be perfect for a counter-force strike, including short-range BrahMos, supersonic cruise missile nearby. It has also a range of nuclear-capable missiles that are part of its naval nuclear strike capabilities. These include missiles like K-15, K-4, Dhanush, Sagarika, and BrahMos, which can be deployed on warships and also on the two nuclear-powered submarines that are already operational. It thus gives India a second strike capability. And in addition, the US has also approved sale of 24 anti-submarine helicopters that would also ramp up its anti-submarine warfare capabilities. India is also set to acquire 5 battalions of S-400 missile defense systems from Russia between 2021 and 2023, which will integrate with India's indigenous systems, the Advanced Air Defense and Prithvi Air Defense. India also has nearly 24 dedicated military satellites that help in communication, surveillance, intelligence, and reconnaissance that would aid in its counter-force strategy. Thus, India's capabilities have expanded both horizontally and vertically, and become more accurate with its smaller and potentially maneuverable warheads. The combination of more weapons, a greater number of accurate delivery vehicles at a higher state of readiness and responsiveness, precise warheads, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, and a layered ballistic missile defense systems gives the option of a preemptive first strike to Indian civil and military leaders. The basic logic behind it is that India can launch a counter-force strike against Pakistan and absorb any surviving missiles through its ballistic missile defense shield. Another associated problem, I believe, is India's propensity to blame Pakistan over its internal security mismanagement vis-a-vis non-state actors. Modi's government has tried to divert attention from its internal failures by warmongering and blaming Pakistan for any incidents within India. There is a debate in the Indian academic circles for finding ways to punish Pakistan for the alleged links to non-state actors. India also tried to frame the post-Pulwama strikes in Pakistan along those lines. Now there's a talk about linking nuclear response to actions by non-state actors. This, I believe, is a very dangerous thinking on Indian part. Even if it is being discussed, it is extremely dangerous and brings more instability to South Asia. Then India's adoption of nuclear counterforce could generate not just an arms race, but dangerous first strike instability where neither side could afford to go second. So they would be faced with this use it or lose it dilemma. Now coming to what Pakistan can do about it, definitely Pakistan needs to adjust its posture to cater for both abandoning of NFU by India and possible preemptive tendencies. Pakistan has the option to use mobility, dispersion, camouflage to increase survivability of its nuclear forces. It has also diversified its delivery systems, which support a mix of short and medium range missiles, and develop multiple independent re-entry vehicles, as well as cruise missiles. It has already developed significant sea-based nuclear assets that would assure a second strike capability, including the submarine launched cruise missile Babar-3. This second strike capability ensures that not all of Pakistan's nuclear assets are destroyed in a nuclear first strike. Then lastly, one small point, besides adjusting its nuclear posture and its foreign policy options, Pakistan needs to build maximum international pressure against India that highlights its aggressive posture and its dangerous nuclear policies. Well, that's it from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ghazala, for briefing us on how India is shifting away from its already ambiguous no first use policy and how it's building itself militarily with modern weaponry and technology along with its regional implications. With this, ladies and gentlemen, now we'll move towards our eminent experts. The first speaker of today's webinar is Dr. Ghulam Mujaddad. Dr. Mujaddad is currently working as a Dean, Department of Aerospace, Science and Strategic Studies at University Islamabad. Previously, he served in Pakistan Air Force as a fighter pilot and retired as an Air Commodore in 2011. He has been on the faculty of the PAF War College and National Defense University Islamabad. He has been assistant professor and head of Department of Strategic and Nuclear Studies, NDU. He has also worked as a senior research fellow at this institute for a brief period. Now I invite Dr. Ghulam Mujaddad to share his thoughts on no first use, continuity or change in Indian nuclear doctrine. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I thank the ISSI for giving this opportunity to me. I am indeed honored. Ms. Ghazala Jalil has been very elaborate with her briefing, and she has covered most of the nooks and corners of the topic that we are going to discuss today, especially mine one. But however, I will take an academic stance to the issue and cover with you a few thoughts on no first use, continuity or change in Indian nuclear doctrine. Next, please. Next. Farhan, next. Nuclear doctrine is a codification of beliefs and a body of
Mujaddad sir, can't hear you.
Sir Qasim, I think his internet has malfunctioned.
Ji.
Shall we move to the next speaker?
You can wait for a second.
Okay, sir. Sir, he has logged out.
No. I think we should move to the next speaker, and I believe when Mujaddad Saab will join again, we can hand over the floor.
Yes,
our second speaker is Air Vice Marshal retired Faiz Ahmad Saab. AVM Amr carries over 37 years of illustrious service in elite institutions of the PA. He has served as Chief Instructor, National Defense College and Commandant, National Security College of National Defense University, Islamabad. In his over 5 years tenure as a Vice Chancellor at Air University, AVM Faiz Ahmad made notable contribution towards higher education in the country. He has represented the country at various international forums. He is a writer and an analyst And in recognition of his meritorious services, he has been awarded Halal-e-Imtiaz Military, Star-e-Imtiaz Military, and Star-e-Bisalat. Now I invite AVM Faiz Ahmad Saab to share his thoughts on preemption and Indian nuclear doctrine implications for Pakistan. Sir, you have the floor, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Director ACDC, Chairman Ambassador Khalid Masood, and Director General ISSI, Ambassador Azaz S. Ahmed Chaudhry. Coming straight to the topic, I shall touch upon 3 points. First, the regional stability dynamics. Second, the Indian floating nuclear doctrine. And third, implications for Pakistan. Regional stability dynamics. In the world's most dangerous region, where 3 nuclear weapon states share borders and flashpoints, one of them has simultaneously hot borders with the other 2. It also had border disputes with all its non-nuclear neighbors. No discussion on Indo-Pak nuclear doctrines and postures would be complete without taking China into account. According to available literature, China does not recognize India as a legal nuclear weapons state. And it does not regard India as a security threat because of the existing major gap in military technology between the 2. Chinese leadership does not deem it fit to respond to Indian nuclear program, either militarily or diplomatically. Deterrence stability between China and India is predicated on both sides espousing no first use. India's toying with its nuclear doctrine disturbs the deterrence stability between the 2 states, which is based on no first use. Now, because of Indian pursuit to counter China, a meaningful headway in arms control between India and Pakistan is practically impossible. This dilemma brings volatility in the Indo-Pakistan relationship. My second point, the Indian floating nuclear doctrine. We find an accord in Indian political, military, and nuclear doctrines in a sense that these are constantly evolving and becoming increasingly assertive and aggressive. Modi doctrine seeks a multipolar Asia and strives to position India as one of the leading global powers. It projects India as the sole net security provider in the Indian Ocean region and as an important member of Quad in Indo-Pacific region. Under Modi, India has been assertive in diplomacy and adventurous in its dealing with its neighbors. The center point of Modi's South Asia policy is to dominate its smaller neighbors and to resist the presence of growing influence in the region of extra-regional forces. Sampling Indian military doctrines, we find that these increasingly becoming in sync with the aggressive political thought. The Joint Warfare Doctrine issued in 2017 espouses both surgical strikes as well as the Cold Start Doctrine, as it cites, I quote, the possibility of subconventional action escalating at a conventional level, unquote. Indian military Army Land Warfare Doctrine 2018 is the first official document that recognizes the possibility of a joint threat from Pakistan and China. This marks a clear shift from single front centric threat planning that has dominated military strategy in India. In essence, the Land Warfare Doctrine 2018 seeks to maintain escalation dominance and codify surgical strikes in pursuit of achieving deterrence by punishment. In the Indian nuclear doctrine, as highlighted earlier, the Indian pledge of no first use is interpreted by Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, former Indian National Security Advisor, and I quote, if we need to preempt, the logic of NFU commitment does not preclude that. In his view, no first use is for non-nuclear weapon states, implying that new NFU does not apply to nuclear powers. Ladies and gentlemen, continuously evolving Indian military capabilities to find, fix, and kill Pakistani strategic assets have generated powerful temptations for Indian leaders to think in terms of options that would permit counterforce targeting of Pakistan's nuclear systems in the event of a serious conflict. And in their view, it does not require a shift in declared nuclear doctrine. And now I'll come to the third point, that is implications for Pakistan. I have developed implications separately for technological and doctrinal domains. First, technological. Remote sensing, conventional strike capabilities, anti-submarine warfare, and cyber warfare techniques will continue to improve and perpetually threaten strategic assets, eroding the foundation of deterrence. Increased SLBM accuracy has transformed the role of ballistic missile submarines, turning these tools of counter value into potent counterforce weapons. Protection of assets is not limited to evading a single platform, such as synthetic aperture radar satellites. Rather, we would have to develop countermeasures to the entire spectrum of capabilities deployed by the adversary. Pakistan, in these dire economic conditions, will be hard-pressed to develop effective countermeasures to the full range of emerging means of counterforce. Now, a few doctrinal implications. As arsenals become more vulnerable, deterrence will weaken. 2, Indian hubris and perception of a strong counterforce capability would increase the temptation to attack, setting in motion a catastrophic chain of events. The failure of the disarming strike by India will provoke a massive punitive response, ruling out the possibility of a controlled nuclear exchange. Fourth, pervasive fear of preemption among Pakistan's national leadership would create an imperative to use nuclear weapons before the adversary. A counterforce strike will cause enormous civilian casualties in the target country, possibly in the neighboring countries as well. The danger of smaller nuclear arsenals is aggravated by improvements in the non-nuclear counterforce means. Pakistan will have to retain retaliatory forces as a hedge against adversaries' technological breakthroughs to maintain the same level of deterrent threat. India, by enhancing its counterforce capabilities, would trigger arms race and perpetuate other dynamics that aggravate political and military conditions. And the last doctrinal implication, I would recommend policymakers and scholars in both countries should abandon the idea that nuclear war was winnable in any meaningful sense. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, survivability is eroding and it will continue to do so in the foreseeable future. Weapons will grow even more accurate, sensors will improve, arsenals that are survivable today, however, can become vulnerable in the future. In Indo-Pakistan nuclear standoff, in near to medium term, India is far from achieving the potency to execute meaningful counterforce strikes against Pakistan's nuclear assets. However, its mere interest in such an ability is likely to provoke both an arms race as well as dangerous incentives of Pakistan to strike first and early in crisis. I thank you.
Thank you, AVM Faiz Ahmed Saab, for highlighting very important aspects of India's preemptive preparedness. And you have rightly pointed out that nuclear war is not winnable. With these remarks, I now believe Ambassador Mr. Mujaddid Saab is back. Sir, are you ready? Kindly unmute Mujaddid Saab mic.
Kindly unmute yourself, sir.
I'm ready. I'm ready.
Sir, please go ahead, sir. You will give the floor to you.
Farhan, can we have the first slide, please? Thank you. Next slide. So we were on the doctrine. Next slide. India maintains credible minimum deterrence against China and Pakistan. A posture of no first use, that is nuclear weapons, will only be used in retaliation against a nuclear attack on Indian territory or on Indian forces anywhere. Nuclear retaliation to a first strike will be massive and designed to inflict unacceptable damage. Nuclear retaliatory attacks would only be authorized by the civilian political leadership. India will have effective, diverse, flexible, and responsive nuclear forces based on a triad of land-based missiles, aircraft, and sea-based missile assets. Non-use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states is assured. In the event of a major attack against India or Indian forces anywhere by biological or chemical weapons, India will retain the option of retaliating with nuclear weapons. Indian nuclear forces, nuclear doctrine does not rescind the option of preemptive strike anywhere in the doctrine, in the self-defense. Next slide, please. Rajnath Singh, the then BJP president, has declared that no review of NFU has been planned and no first use was a great initiative of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and there is no compromise on that. We are very clear, no first use is a reflection of our cultural inheritance. This is the strand of pro-continuity NFU arguments within India. So in an April 2014 interview, Modi clearly stated, no first use was a great initiative of Atal Bihari Vajpayee. There is no compromise on that. We are very clear. It is a reflection of our cultural inheritance. In Japan, in August 2014, once he was the Prime Minister, he said that there is a tradition of national consensus on continuity of such issues. I can tell you that currently we are not taking any initiative for a review of our nuclear doctrine. Ever since PM Modi has not taken up issue of revision of the nuclear doctrine during the preceding 5 years. In its 2019 election manifesto, strangely, BJP had completely skipped any mention of the determination to shift India's nuclear posture, unlike its 2014 manifesto. Next slide, please. Please, next slide. Retired Indian officials like Shiv Shankar Menon, former Secretary and NSA, and General B.S. Nagal, former Commander-in-Chief of the Strategic Force Command, have questioned, however, the morality and sanctity of no first use. This is the strand which is pro-change debate in India itself about the NFU. Menon highlights that there is a potential gray area as to when India would use nuclear weapons first against another nuclear weapon state. Circumstances are conceivable in which India might find it useful to strike first, for instance, against a nuclear weapon state that had declared it would certainly use its weapon, and if India were certain that adversary's launch was imminent. He further says that India would hardly risk giving Pakistan the chance to carry out a massive nuclear strike after the Indian response to Pakistan using tactical nuclear weapons. Menon and some other Indian officials hold that preemptive use upon warning of imminent Pakistan launch is consistent with its existing NFU policy. Next, please.
Sir, I think we are facing technical issues again regarding Sir Mujaddid's internet.
Yes, sir, can you hear us?
No, sir, I think his internet has malfunctioned. He cannot hear or see us.
Okay.
Shall we move on to the next speaker? Sir, he has logged out again.
Look, I think Mujaddid Sahab is facing some internet difficulties, and I think we should move to our next speaker. The third speaker of this webinar is Dr. Rabi Akhtar. Dr. Akhtar is working as a Director, Center for Security Strategy and Policy Research, and also as a Director, School of Integrated Social Sciences at the University of Lahore. She holds a PhD in Security Studies from Kansas State University. She is the author of the book titled The Blind Eye, U.S. Non-Proliferation Policy Towards Pakistan from Ford to Clinton. Dr. Akhtar is also a member of Pakistan's Prime Minister's Advisory Council on Foreign Affairs. Now I request Dr. Abi Akhtar to share her thoughts on Indian nuclear weapons modernization, implications for deterrent stability. You have the floor now.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank Chairman Ambassador Khalid Mahmood, DG Ambassador Azaz Chaudhry, Director ACDC, Mr. Malik Qasim, for inviting me to be a part of this August panel on this important topic when our region is undergoing strategic shifts and is confronted with trilateral complexities emanating from 3 nuclear weapon states bordering each other with territorial disputes. Excellent presentation by AVM Faiz Amir and a lot of ground covered by Air Commodore Ghulam Mujaddid. So I'm conscious of my time and I will be concise and would want us and our audience to consider the following. I am not going to tell you, the military balance overview because you can visit CIPRI's website for that. You can also look at the military balance that IISS releases. What I'm going to be doing today is more conceptual in nature, which should allow us to think more about modernization and deterrent stability. So here is what I propose to the audience, and I hope that you find this thought-provoking. Number one, what is the Indian defense modernization geared towards? Who is India's principal enemy? Is it Pakistan or is it China or is it both as is touted by the two-front war scare? India has spent more than $100 billion on force modernization, updating its outdated war-fighting machinery in the past 7 years. The purchase of 36 Rafale aircraft from France is alone worth US $8.7 billion. And you will see that once purchased, India will use them against Pakistan for deterrence signaling, which is meant actually for China. I have termed this new type of deterrence as surrogate deterrence, but that's another topic for another day. Since direct deterrence is risky, you find a surrogate and Pakistan plays that power for India where China is concerned. India has moved from Sundarji Doctrine to Pole Star Doctrine in the past 2 decades. The Land Warfare Doctrine of 2018 allows for Indian Army to use IBGs for small-scale incursions below nuclear threshold. Interestingly, post-Doklam, the Land Warfare Doctrine, devoted exclusively to the LAC with China, notes the need to be prepared for any escalation, with the caveat that deliberate transgressions along the line of actual control will be responded with actions that cause minimal escalation in consonance with existing agreements and protocols. Beyond diplomacy, actions in the domain of minimal escalation will be employed according to this land warfare doctrine. I ask you, why didn't then we see this employment in Galwan? Will we see this if China continues to claim other parts of Indian territory at the line of control? Perhaps. The land warfare doctrine talks about Sino-Pak collusion, something to what AVM Faiz Amir also mentioned, and is the first official Indian doctrine to do so. So India on paper, according to my mind, has a plan, which makes sense. But will its execution be as easy? Galwan tells us that perhaps India still has a very long way to go and might rethink what minimal escalation vis-a-vis China will look like. My second point is about the changing nature of warfare, which is undergoing a paradigm shift towards non-contact and standoff capabilities, autonomous weapon systems, electronic warfare, cyber capabilities that can have a decisive or degrading effect in the battlefield. Interestingly, the Indian land warfare doctrine makes a mention of these disruptive technologies. But again, on paper, it looks brilliant. But will it stand a chance against PLA's warfare capabilities and their integration of disruptive technologies? Those who look at force postures and military modernization patterns of major powers would tell you that China has been increasing the levels of its military modernization, filling the gaps to meet its national security requirements. Is India doing the same? That's the question. My third point is about modernization and deterrent stability. It is important not only for India, but also for Pakistan to deeply study the 3 warfares concept PLA employs. the concept of public opinion warfare, second, psychological warfare, and legal warfare. The first warfare, media or public opinion warfare, attempts to shape public opinion both domestically and internationally. The second, the psychological warfare, attempts to influence foreign decision makers and how they approach China policy. The third seeks to shape the legal context for Chinese actions, and it builds a legal justification for Beijing's actions using their domestic laws to signal what Chinese intentions actually are. Together, these three warfares constitute a significant formal part of Chinese deterrence strategy. China's multiple adversaries and PLA spends a lot of time and energy managing these adversarial relationships through these three warfares. So for the overall deterrence stability in the region, as I see it, you need to look at two dyads separately. Within the India-China dyad, the equation is different because China does not deal with India as a nuclear weapon state. There is a general strategic anxiety that exists within this dyad, but nuclear weapons do not figure out as prominently as they do in the second dyad between India and Pakistan. Secondly, the dilemma for India is that it cannot have a credible and minimal deterrence posture towards both China and Pakistan. And that's where the overall deterrence stability, to my mind, weakens. What is credible deterrence for Pakistan is not necessarily credible when it comes to China. What is minimally required to deter Pakistan is certainly not what is required to deter China. So I understand this dilemma for India, whereby it needs to maintain two different deterrence doctrines for its two nuclear neighbors, which adds to the fragility of the overall strategic deterrence in our region. And that is also where its no first use doctrine is tied in. NFU is not feasible for India going forward, and you will see India formally adopt a first use doctrine in coming years to justify its evolving deterrence posture vis-a-vis both China and Pakistan. This brings me to my last point. Since India faces this dilemma of dual deterrence doctrines, its force modernization vis-a-vis both China and Pakistan is also different. The planes and the missiles needed to conventionally deter Pakistan are different from those that India needs to deter China. So going forward, here is what I want all of us to think about. Number one, China blinked in Doklam. The 2-month border standoff ended with China abandoning the road buildup and agreed to returning status quo ante in the Tri-Junction area. After what has happened in Galwan, and with the loosening of the alignment between Bhutan and India, will we see a redux of Doklam with China coming back to build the road, and this time India not being welcomed by Bhutan to stop China? Number two, from here onwards, how will India's overall reduced influence in its neighborhood with countries like Bhutan and Nepal and aggressive Chinese postures and land readjustments affect India's deterrence vis-a-vis China? Do nuclear weapons even have a role in this scenario? India cannot use, mind it, the threat of nukes to settle Doklam 2.0 if it happens. It cannot use the threat of nukes to take back Galwan or other areas should China claim them. Number three, so what are we looking at? There is bound to be a strategic rethink in Indian nuclear and security establishment to focus on what leverages it can develop vis-a-vis China that would deter China from further diluting Indian influence in the neighborhood. No amount of military modernization, nuclear or conventional, can add to already existing deterrence equation. So India must think out of the box. The stage, I believe, is set for India. The future of warfare is non-contact war with disruptive technologies at play, having the potential to dilute Indian deterrence and neutralize any advantage force modernization might have or for India or for any state in the future in the region. So states like India and Pakistan must therefore focus on their deterrence doctrines to account for this new reality. So this is how I look at the overall modernization, Indian defense modernization going forward and its relationship with deterrence, stability in our region. And I hope this would provoke some debate and thinking with the audience. I would like to stop here and would be looking towards the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rabia, for sharing a deep insight on how India is modernizing itself to compete for a two-front war with Pakistan and China, and also highlighting important aspects of India's nuclear deterrence capabilities and how they are going to impact the overall regional situation. I believe Ghulam Mujaddid Saab is back, and I hope he has fixed his technical issue with the laptop. Sir, I hand over the floor again to you. And
thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, dear Qasim and Farhan, for bearing with me. I think my issue is more than my laptop. Okay, let it be a few slides back, please. On the okay, so this was the charter, chapter 7, article 51, which gives right of preemption in the scenario of self-defense. Next, please. Next. Continuing with this, in 2019, General B.S. Nagal gave the most explicit argument for a preemptive counterforce, and he wrote that strategic deterrence can follow a policy of first use when there is an unstable and unpredictable adversary, hereby eliminating the dilemma of responding to battlefield weapons or having to qualify circumstances of use with no first use. The basic requirement, he said, is to have an assured capability of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance to detect, identify, track, and destroy the nuclear assets of the adversary. This capability must be real-time, day and night, all weather and multi-mode to make it foolproof, which allows the employment of nuclear weapons at the right time and right place. Next, please. Combination for more weapons, a greater number of accurate delivery vehicles at a higher state of readiness and responsiveness, including operational nuclear, precise warhead, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, and a layered ballistic missile defense system allows Indian civil military leaders to contemplate first strike strategies or launch or warning strategies that use nuclear missiles to target adversaries' nuclear arsenal, and then rely on BMD defenses as far as possible to intercept any assets that survive the disarming attempt. The next is an enumeration of the Indian space technologies and assets that give India this capability, that India is increasingly capable of destroying what it can find in Pakistan. For an effective comprehensive counterforce, India is fast attaining capability to find, fix, and destroy or intercept Pakistan's strategic nuclear arsenal. One qualifier before I go to the next slide, that there are operational impediments into what India would do. That notwithstanding, these are the...
I think we lost him again.
Sir, we are, I think, facing the same problem with his internet. Shall we move to the next speaker, sir?
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, we're really sorry that we are facing some internet difficulty from Mr. Mujaddid's side. And now we'll move to our fourth speaker, and speaker of this topic which we have assigned is the shift in Indian nuclear doctrine and deterrence stability option for Pakistan. Our fourth speaker is Air Marshal retired M. Ashfaq Karai. Air Marshal Ashfaq is working as a Director, Strategic Defense and Security at Center for Aerospace and Security Studies, Islamabad. He served in Pakistan Air Force for over 41 years as a fighter pilot and in various senior command and staff assignments. In recognition of his meritorious services, the Air Marshal has been decorated with the distinguished awards of Tamga Imtiaz Military, Stara Imtiaz Military, Halal Imtiaz Military, and Stara Bisalat. Now I request Air Marshal retired Muhammad Ashfaq Karai to share his thoughts on the subject. Sir, you have the floor. Ashfaq Sahab, you have the floor, sir. Kindly unmute Ashfaq sir.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Sir. Yes, sir. Please, sir, go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm thankful to Chairman Ambassador Khalid, Ambassador Ajaz DG, and Mr. Malik Qasim for having invited me for this. And I will be basically talking about will India change its doctrine based on my experience having been in India for about 3 years. And I'll be discussing on that aspect and what Pakistan can do. As it has already been mentioned, that the debate on the Indian nuclear doctrine started soon after the Pokhran 2 test, when one of the scientists revealed that the test had fizzled out with a yield much lower than what was claimed. And many people argued that why India should go for the no first use. While many in India have been advocating for revocation of NFU, revisiting the nuclear doctrine has also been discussed by the current and former defense ministers, as well as the former NSA. The February 27 setback has given fresh impetus to this debate. As has been discussed, Indian nuclear doctrine is based on no first use and credible minimum deterrence. However, the ground reality is different. As India continues to build its nuclear arsenal, develop missile program, and enhance its missile defense, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, India's current missile modernization has exceeded what is necessary for a minimum credible deterrence. And the resources put in to develop and acquire capabilities exceed what is required for a strictly retaliatory nuclear arsenal. It's therefore clear that there is a vast gap between Indian nuclear doctrine and the reality on ground. While BJP had it in its manifesto in 2014 and removed it in 2019 pre-election, but still it is likely that keeping up with the 2014 electoral promise and statements by some of its leaders, it is likely to revisit the nuclear doctrine. This exercise could result in 3 possible options: the option of first use, flexible response, and maintaining status quo. The first use option will have very wide acceptability in India, especially with the Hindutva hardliners. Internationally, this may, however, raise concerns and could create some difficulties in Indian endeavors for the nuclear suppliers group membership. This would also not go down well with China. Additionally, with conventional force balance heavily tilted in Indian favor, opting for first use puts the capabilities of our armed forces under question. Additionally, implementation of this policy will necessitate stringent operational preparedness and place nuclear forces on hair-trigger alert with forward deployment. Since the first use posture is vulnerable to a preemptive attack, in addition to a credible ISR system, dispersal of warheads would also be a necessity. This would require large inventories for survivability and swift mobilization. All these actions are likely to create an atmosphere of vertical proliferation. This entire scenario would not be conducive to sustaining crisis stability in South Asia. Looking at the prerequisites for such a posture, as well as likely implications, this option seems least likely. As a logical evolution, India could opt for flexible response option, aiming to allow policymakers to take decisions according to the crisis situation. These may include preemptive strike, counter force and counter value targeting, and assured destruction through massive retaliation. This option would also require a variety of weapons, modernization of delivery systems, good ISR capability, and higher alert states. International reaction is likely to be somewhat similar to the first use option. This brings us to the last option of maintaining status quo. Keeping in mind the backlash on revocation of Article 370 and 35A, border disputes with all its neighbors and tensions with China, India is not likely to make an aggressive doctrine at this time. Therefore, during the review, the Indian decision makers may debate alternative doctrinal options and do nothing thereafter, except some minor changes. The debate would in itself portray Modi as a strong leader. Internationally, it will be used to build image of a responsible nuclear states, avoid open competition with China, and get support for the NSC membership. However, India will continue to add more weapons to her inventory, modernize her delivery systems, and upgrade her intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, and go for a robust air defense system. This in turn will help adopt any option during a crisis situation. And this is more evident from the statements of many of their leaders and think tanks. Keeping in view the Indian hypocrisy as well as ambiguity on its no first use, Pakistan cannot take Indian statements on face value. Our response options, instead of announced Indian nuclear doctrine, should be based on assessment of ground realities, which include nuclear weapon development, modernization of delivery systems, ABM and BMD systems, and ISR capability, etc. Since Pakistan never trusted Indian no first use, revocation of NFU by India should not have any serious consequences. As Pakistan has always worked towards maintaining strategic stability in the region, it should take all possible measures to counter Indian designs without entering in an arms race or open competition. Pakistan must continue the work to consolidate full spectrum deterrence, improve upon its MIRV and cruise missile capability, plan for good dispersal to cater for counter-force strike, develop a robust command and control system for quick decision-making, and build a credible second strike capability that could deter India from any misadventure. This will also necessitate Pakistan to place its nuclear weapons on higher alert status to avoid use it or lose it dilemma, pushing the region towards instability. I thank you for that, and I'll be ready for answering any questions.
Thank you, Ishfaq Sahab, for highlighting options for Pakistan. And you rightly pointed out that Pakistan have all the options to defend against any Indian threat or aggression. Now we will move towards our next remarks, and these are keynote remarks. And ladies and gentlemen, the speaker of our today's webinar is Professor Han Hua. Han Hua is currently working as Director, Center for Arms Control and Disarmament at School of International Studies, Peking University. She has been a visiting researcher at Belfort Center, Howard University, United States, School of International Affairs, Georgia Institute of Technology, United States, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Sweden, and the Stimson Center, United States. She teaches courses on international relations, arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. She also writes on nuclear deterrence in South Asia, international relations theory, and other subjects. Now I request Professor Han Hua to deliver her keynote remarks. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for giving me this a great opportunity to share my thought on the newly emerged topic about the shift of Indian nuclear doctrine and its implications for regional deterrence stability. It's my great honor to really talk to the distinguished participants of this seminar, because it's a really valuable experience for me to really talk about nuclear issue with only our Pakistani counterparts. And I also think the shift of Indian doctrine has really make kind of end of Indians' restraint, so-called restraint nuclear deterrence. But what they are talking about is counter value, from counter value to counter force capability, or some other capabilities we talked about in our previous distinguished speakers already. They talk about, but I still think when they talk about this capability is still, I mean, I still put a little bit doubt on that. If India has already shifted or has already gained the capabilities to realize what they want to do. For example, the first strikes against the Pakistani, I mean, hard targets, and then maybe like Naren just elaborate before. He said maybe 90% of the targets were rounded by the first strike, and then something, I mean, from Pakistani side, I mean, fed back, and then the defense system in India will interject all of them. So that scenario, something like a kind of nuclear primacy on the first strike capability. But I think it's still far, far away from that. When we talk about now, what the Indian has now is a little bit far away. I mean, quite far away from that. Even they have already made progress in, we talk about the surveillance and also some reconnaissance, or also satellites, or missile defense system, or command control system, but all are still in the, I mean, process, if I can say that. But if now is the time to say they have already have the capability to launch that kind of, I mean, systems against Pakistan or China. I mean, Naren said at this moment, maybe they have the capability to deal with Pakistan, not right now for China yet. But I think even for Pakistan, the nuclear balance still not in that kind of a favorable stand, favorable for India. I mean, the survivability of Pakistan is still something, right? I don't think the imbalance is that big in terms of nuclear capability or nuclear deterrence. And also, we talk about the progress in this capability-driven, I mean, efforts in India. But when we talk about operational or use of capabilities, are still another step. So that's what I understand. Now we talk about the shift or some kind of new capability India has already engaged in. But another remark, Mark, I want to say is that I still don't think the scenario, the first strike scenario from Indian side, when we talk about nuclear attack, first attack is a little bit far away. But it's interesting to say the narrative of the shift of a nuclear doctrine in India is pretty much the same time when they really observe some very provocative military conventional attacks from Indian side against the Pakistan. If we talk about 2016, the so-called surgical attack across the line of control. And also we observed the last year's the February attack boycott airstrike, we saw another really, I mean, I think it's quite a broad action against Pakistan. So in that sense, I think the conventional scenario or conventional deterrence is something very important between India and Pakistan at this moment. What the role of nuclear weapons in India has in their decision to launch a conventional attack against Pakistan is very important. So when I think about this, I have I really observed a very new dynamic between India and Pakistan. Normally, we observe so many in the crisis. We always talk about maybe Indians. I mean, in action against Pakistan, but from the 2016, we see very different dynamic. I mean, some people like Dalton just mentioned, it's a kind of a luck. Last crisis, they didn't escalate into the nuclear exchange. But how about next time, Indian launch another preemptive conventional attack in Pakistan? Something will happen. That's really, I think, a very important thing we have to think about. So whether or not India is deterred from using conventional force against Pakistan, I think three things we have to think about. The first one is Indian leaders' understanding of the requirements of effective conventional deterrence. The second one is their assessment of the war-fighting capability of Pakistan. The third one is their assessment of the resolve of Pakistan to really defend the critical national interests. So putting together, I think the Indians, if Indian is deterred from using conventional force, depends on the cost that they calculate before they launch that conventional attack. So here, I really think three factors, I think they are important. The first one is the national interest. The stakes or the interest, if the imbalance of the interest between India and Pakistan is, I think when we talk about the Indians' conventional attack against the target inside, cross the international boundary, inside the Pakistan territory to bomb a so-called the camp. In that sense, I think the Pakistan national interest is much higher than the Indian interest. So that's one. And the second is a capability. We talk about Indians' capability is not there, especially when we talk about the escalation dominance capability is still far away. So I think the risks are much higher if the capability is not there yet, but they do something, I mean, to really provoke. And lastly, the resolve, the political resolve to use nuclear weapons or other weaponry systems. So these are three factors I think are very important to think about. I mean, the interest related to the resolve. If I think Jervis talked about the balance of capability. If the capability, I mean, imbalance of the capabilities are there, but sometimes resolves can make up for them. So balance of capability, balance of resolve, balance of interest. I think at this point, I mean, the Indians conventional or sub-nuclear level actions is something they should consider more at this moment. That's my comments and some preliminary thoughts.
Thank you, Professor. Especially thanks again for accepting our invitation and joining us today and sharing your thought on this very important subject and highlighting Pakistan's capabilities and assessment on this current situation. Ladies and gentlemen, with this we come to our next session, that is the question and answer session. And before we start our Q&A session, I believe Dr. Mujaddad has been disconnected for several times. So I would request Dr. Mujaddad that if you want to share any final thought at this moment so that we can start our Q&A afterwards. Over to you, Dr. Ghulam Mujaddad. Sir, if you want to share any of your final thought at this moment, sir.
Yes, thank you very much for your patience and thank you very much for your accommodation, Qasim. It has been really an honor. Okay, I have the opinion that Indians will retain their no first use policy because there is enough flexibility available within the policy to do whatever they want to do. For example, the preemptive first strike, there is enough kind of a leeway available in the NFU. If they abandon NFU, for India, it will not be a welcome thing because India wants to keep moral stature in its nuclear policy of NFU, especially once it has the options within the NFU available to do the things. The more important thing to watch are the Indian capabilities. These are the capabilities that provide the strategists with new ways and means of achieving their objective. And Indian capabilities are to be watched, as our Chinese honorable guest was saying, that presently they may not be at that level, but definitely the Indian endeavor is to create those capabilities of preemptive counter-force strike, especially against Pakistan. Against China, India will maintain this differentiated kind of nuclear posture, and and it is with respect to China also that India will never change the NFU posture of its own. Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for giving me the chance to explain a little bit.
Thank you, Dr. Ghulam Mujaddad. Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is now open for any question and answers. Kindly identify yourself and also indicate to whom your question is addressed. The floor is open now. Asaf, you want to add something, sir?
Right. Well, I must say it was a very, very interesting discussion. And my own personal impressions are along the lines of what Ghulam Mujaddad Saab has just said, that India doesn't need to change its NFU, although it will continue to give signals that it can manipulate its NFU to have that space which is required for its preemptive strikes capabilities against neighbors, which it thinks that it can take on. I also agree with him that the real issue would be the capability, and that's where the deficit is, and that's where the Indians are currently focused. Professor Hu also made a very important point that if India wants to continue with preemptive strikes posture, I think it is a very risky and very dangerous precept. They need to think many times because in September 2016, they just claimed there was no strike. But in February 2019, there was a strike. And what if the damage to Pakistan is of the proportions that Pakistan deems it fit to respond? So I think it is not a sensible approach by India to engage in preemptive strikes against a neighbor which has nuclear capability. My question would be, I don't know who can answer it, but maybe Professor Hu. How is United States factoring into all this? The United States has deepened its partnership with India. The United States wants to contain China. The United States thinks that India would be a good counterweight to China. Is that giving an encouragement to India to explore further capabilities that it can employ to boost its own doctrines vis-a-vis the two neighbors that it has?
Thank you, Azasa. Dr. Han, would you like to respond to Mr. Azad's question?
Yeah, very important question. I think especially when we talk about last year, February attack from India to the target inside Pakistan, I think some people in the media, they talk about maybe the US role in the intelligence sharing. I mean, especially when we talk about the recent years, the new treaty was signed or reached between India and the United States regarding the intelligence sharing. So in that sense, especially when we talk about the Pompeo, the Secretary of State Pompeo, or Bolton at that time also talked something about they stand side with India. That role is was very different from when we talk about Cargill or other crises. In the previous cases or crisis, the U.S. role was usually like the mediator, and to prevent, to convince India not to take action. But this the last two cases, I saw very different role the U.S. played.
Thank you, Professor Wa. Any of other participants would like to respond to this question?
Yes, this is Dr. Ghulam Mujaddid. If you permit me, I would.
Sure.
I had this in my slides, the increase in Indian capabilities. The increase in Indian capability has also been caused by Indo-US nuclear deal, by the NSG waiver, by Indo-France nuclear deal, and by civil nuclear deal, and by Indo-Israel strategic partnerships. These strategic partnerships have actually indirectly enhanced Indian capabilities, and they would do so more in future. Especially the Indo-United States strategic partnership that holds very close grounds in space, cyberspace, and other technologies. I believe that there is operational coordination between the space assets of United States, Israel, and India as far as the South Asia is concerned. So that's a very, very operational role that United States of America is actually playing in South Asia as far as the Indian preemptive or offensive deterrence capabilities are concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dr. Rabia, would you like to respond to this question?
Yes, sure. Thank you so much for this question. I think US will always, historically has remained relevant and will continue to remain relevant. The only, problem I have with the argument where we become complacent and say that India is not going to shed its NFU and will, because it already has enough, room within its current NFU doctrine. I have a problem with that because, we shouldn't just take things on face value. I know we keep on saying that Pakistan has already factored it in. Pakistan never took the Indian NFU seriously. But with this increasing debate within India and also their media projections about Pakistan-Chinese collusion, India can take refuge, since it has that victim mentality. If India does shed NFU and go for first use, the world will simply understand because India would have built a narrative which you clearly see it building. And it will slowly move from that point on, from NFU to a FU, and I see that transition happening very, very smoothly, where nobody in the world, including the United States, is going to question India as to why it has shed it. So once we say that India will have some reputational costs attached to moving from NFU to FU, the way India is building this narrative, I think it will be very easy for the world to buy it because now it is hedging that narrative in the overall Pak-China collusion or a two-front war theory against India. And once you take refuge in that and you build that narrative and you have a strong lobby and you have anti-China alliances, it will be very easy for India to make that transition. So just on the, on that side of it. So with respect to its strategic alliance with the United States, there's just absolutely no question about it, that United States sees a much bigger role for India now, especially after Galwan. Its own apprehensions about China, about its aggressiveness and its posturing have been, reiterated. So I do see China, United States using India to sort of amplify its own, concerns about China's assertiveness. So that's where I see this headed with respect to NFU to FU transition, where United States will be the first one to say that we completely understand as to why India has made that transition. So when Pakistan, develops its own responses, Pakistan should not, just say that, India will suffer reputational costs and therefore India will have the rationality about it and then India will not move towards that direction. I think that's a very simplistic way of looking at it. The situation is complex and Pakistan needs to develop its responses accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rabia Akhtar. Faisal, yeah, Faisal, please go ahead, sir.
I'll take up both the points. First, the nuclear ambiguity by the Indians. I think by allowing them this nuclear ambiguity that they officially maintain the facade of no first use so that they do not disturb the world and they do not disturb the Chinese. At the same time, their thought leaders propagating the possibility of first use or even preemptive. They've been talking about it very widely. I think Pakistan needs to expose that, and we need to accept that India has certainly moved from an NFU to a preemptive or a first use policy, because this first strike instability is what causes the problem and causes the arms race, the uncertainty, the instability. So I think the Indians should not be allowed that doctrinal ambiguity in their approach. We may determine, the world may know that what capabilities do they have, but it is for us to continue to expose their doctrinal ambiguity. Second point, about the American influence in our region. I think there are I would like to make 2 points. First, the America has been able to achieve what it wanted to achieve for over a very long time, to embroil China in the local disputes, militarily local disputes. And the very fact that they moved, or they're planning to move their troops from Germany and Europe to South China Sea is one of those indicators that they are trying to keep this issue between China and India alive. So China just starts looking inward and does not look outward, of which one looks at the BRI politics. Definitely the Americans and the Indians together, they do not support BRI. My second point is that in the last February, earlier, whenever there was a conflict or there was ever inflammation in subcontinent, the Americans were the sole party to talk to both the sides and pacify the situation and bring peace or bring sense in the region. I think in last February 2019, after the Pulwama and Balakot incident, China and America both together probably intervened to put down the Indian irrational response that they were probably moving. China pacified Pakistan, and probably, I'm not sure, but probably the resolution of that conflict, or that the release of the Indian pilot could have been an advice from China. So I think at this time, when the subcontinent flared up, both China and America, USA, they worked together to bring peace to the region. And one more point, Malik Qasim Saab, my name is Faiz Amir and not Faiz Amir.
I'm sorry, sir, I pronounced it wrongly, but Dr. Rabia, are you there? Ambassador Azaz, I have a question for you, that if India wants to move away from its NFU, what it is the net gain to get it? Please.
So yeah, I sort of wrote it as well. I think, it's just for optics. I don't think so. India wants to achieve anything that the current NFU posting doesn't want it, doesn't accord it. But when I look at it, I think it allows India to achieve two things. One, it wants to legitimize this Sino-Pak collusion or two-front war theory, and say that, see, this is a real threat. India faces these two countries who are nuclear weapon states and harbor, nefarious designs towards China. So by amplifying the threat of this collusion, it affords India to shed the NFU, go for the FU, and retain the first strike advantage. Secondly, it also is going to unnerve, once you shed all the ambiguities, it's going to unnerve both Pakistan and China. And that could be a strategic objective in itself. All I'm saying is that, in coming years, the time is just going to be right. And the world will understand, like the world always understands, what India wants to do. 1974 happened, the world sort of absorbed it. 1998 happened, the world absorbed it. For the past, so many years, 2 decades almost since our nuclearization in the region, the world has understood India's narrative. The world has understood India's threat perceptions. And why wouldn't the world now buy India's narrative about a Sino-Pak two-front war theory, which would include the nuclear weapons in some, segment of its, figment of its imagination, whether you think nuclear weapons have a role to play or not. All I'm saying is that this transition is going to post Galwan, losing those soldiers, the way they have died, has created enough sympathy, with the rest of the world as to how, India has been cornered, and now India needs to, find out ways to fight China and then Pakistan as well. So that's my reply to Ambassador Azaz Chaudhry's question.
Thank you, Dr. Rabia, for your excellent remark. Marshal Ashfaq Sahab, would you like to add any comment to this debate?
Thank you. I would just want to add that my views are of the practitioners and not the academic side per se. The Indians, whatever they announce, it takes them decades to achieve that or to go in that direction. That is one thing. And since Prime Minister Modi himself and some of the other people have also been saying that we are not revisiting also, it's not likely that they'll change their doctrine in near future. Except, as Dr. Rabia mentioned, that it gives them that strategic advantage of getting very clear, and the world will buy their argument that they are facing Chinese and Pakistani threat. Other than that, their preparations are for the first use, and I don't think they will abandon that ever. So Pakistan's preparations have to be, or response options have to be accordingly. And it is our capability, especially the second strike capability, and which will deter India from any misadventure towards our side, whether they announce first use or they continue with the no first use, and our resolve. These are the two important aspects. And as a practitioner, would India in coming years be able to take out all Pakistani nuclear weapons? If that's not possible, they would rather not go for the first strike. Thank you.
Thank you, Ishfaq sir. We have another question from the floor, and anybody can respond to it, that what is the possibility of India going to war below the nuclear threshold? Faisal, would you like to respond?
Yes, I think India would restrict itself to what it calls surgical strikes and leave the escalation part to Pakistan. In any future conflict, like in the past 26 February, I think air power will be the first instrument that the Indians would like to use. And the Pakistan's response, and then the aggravation in that air war, air battle, probably would take for first few days, the air battle will continue. And that would probably be the Indian desire also. And those 2-3 days time, probably a week's time, probably would allow the world fraternity to calm down the situation. One sees the landing of Rafale in end of July could bolster Indian Air Force morale, and it could probably provoke its own leadership into being more aggressive on the borders. Though it's too early for a new weapon system to be absorbed doctrinally and training-wise and tactics-wise, and an Air Force takes many years, but probably the kind of pressure the Indian Air Force and the military has been feeling over the past 1 year from Pakistan and now from China, they might adventure into something more salient, but that's what they've been talking about.
This is Commodore Mujahid. May I, Qasim, add something to?
Sure, sir. Sure, sir. You can
Sir,
respond.
thank you very much, and Assalamu alaikum, Sir Faiz. I didn't have the
Assalamu
opportunity to say that formally because of my problems. Sir, I believe that there is a space for India under the nuclear overhang to undertake a limited war. Let's face the realities, and for that we probably need to study the April 2017 Joint Doctrine of Indian Armed Forces and Indian Land Forces Doctrine of 2018. I think a collusion and combination of space assets and the capabilities that Indians have gained to control the escalation, and then to do at the conventional level whatever aim that they have. Of course, it will be a limited aim that India would have, but increasingly with these strategic partnerships and the Indian collusion around the globe, Indians feel very confident to take a conventional war, of course, for the limited objectives and aims under the nuclear overhang. Thank you.
Thank you, Mujahid sir. We have another question from the floor. that considering our economic position, should we be matching India weapon for weapon?
Can I respond to it?
Sure, sir, please, sir.
I think that has never been Pakistan's policy, professed policy, that Pakistan would match India weapon to weapon, either conventionally or in the strategic domain. It is so obvious that the imbalance between the conventional arms spending or defense budget is 1:7 against our about 10-11 billion. India is spending over 70 billion in their budget, and India is the largest arms importer in the world. So it would be probably not right to think that Pakistan can match India weapon to weapon, or Pakistan should try and match. Pakistan should maintain a deterrent posture both in conventional and in the nuclear domain, but never indulge into arms race, what the Indians desire us to do that. At the same time, probably Pakistan should look at more closely at whatever is available to explore the space domain, start exploring the space domain, because that is where we lag behind, and that is where the major difference between the two nuclear powers or nuclear weapon states remain. And space would become one of the major domains, battle domains in decades ahead. So while I do not recommend matching weapon to weapon, I do recommend Pakistan exploring space. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Rabia, would you like to respond to this question?
Yes, sure. I would completely agree with Ibn Faisal. Pakistan does not need to, Pakistan does not have the kind of money, Pakistan does not have the kind of economy to match weapon to weapon, and also Pakistan does not have that kind of a doctrine to match weapon to weapon. Pakistan has this credible minimum doctrine, and whatever is credible, whatever number requires Pakistan to maintain credible deterrence vis-a-vis India, that is what needs to be maintained. And since it is a very dynamic, situation between it is vis-a-vis India, so if India increases its numbers, then Pakistan obviously would need to see as to how many numbers would it need to, maintain that credibility. So minimal is not fixed in time and space. Minimum will be relative to what India does. And I'm sure that Pakistan's strategic planners are looking at it. There's absolutely zero need to match numbers to numbers. And that's not the way that Pakistan needs to go ahead with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rabia. Anyone else want to respond to this question? Rosala, do you have any question in your mind, or should we move towards the concluding session?
Actually, I kind of had a question, but it has already been covered partially. I would just like to draw attention of the panelists towards the role of international context that's currently prevailing. And that is characterized by abandoning of arms control agreements, arrangements, and renewal of arms race between the great powers, US, Russia, China, India. So, and there's also talk about resumption of nuclear testing by the US. And all this international context, I believe it is emboldening India in its pursuits, and it's encouraging India. So that's a comment from my side. And if any of the panelists want to respond on that, that would be, what are the implications of this developing international context for us in South Asia, India, Pakistan, China?
I believe Dr. Professor Hua has raised his hand. Professor Han Hua, would you like to respond to this question?
No, sorry, I just want to raise a question rather than answering that question. Is that okay?
You can raise your question, and then we can ask it.
Okay. Because since 2008, the compulsory dialogue between India and Pakistan have been suspended. I know from Indian side, they have no intention to resume the dialogue, or I mean the compulsory dialogue with Pakistan, especially I mean the nuclear confidence building measures. But I still think that's important to prevent some we call the inadvertent nuclear escalation. But can I ask our Pakistani counterparts to explain a little bit about the possibility in the near future?
Can I take the question, Qasim? You're muted.
Sure, sir. You can respond to that question.
First question by Mr. Azala, role of international context. You see, for a very long time, the international nuclear regime is in a flux. 4 nuclear weapon states, Pakistan, India, Israel, North Korea, are out of the NPT, and they continue to function out of the NPT, and there has not been a concerted effort to give a particular status to these 4 states. The other element that keeps the international nuclear regime in flux is the Chinese not accepting nuclear weapons, India as a nuclear weapon state, and not talking to them on the deterrence side. Third thing is the 123 agreement, or the US nuclear deal with India in 2008, that gives all the waiver to India in favor of India to start dealing with NSG. I think these are the 3 very major events that keep the international nuclear regime in a flux, and continuing up till now. I think with the extension to New START agreement not being taking place between Russia and United States. United States is adamant to bring China into it, whereas China refuses to be a part of any negotiations between US and Russia, because China maintains that its nuclear arsenal is not at a stage that it should get involved into the US-Russian negotiations. So these are a few of the Americans taking that refuge behind China and not starting to talk with Russia. These are all things that are keeping the nuclear regime very flexible, very unpredictable. And I think this is going to continue for some time. Russia has been upgrading its weapons. America has been upgrading its weapons. And probably the present stance of US of going to conduct a test is probably more for the domestic audience than probably for the international regime. The question that Ms. Juan raised about the CPMs between Pakistan and India, I think these would be welcome in any circumstances and at any level, whether it is conventional level or whether it is the strategic level. But considering the prevalent aggressive political, both domestic and international attitude that prevails in India, both on media as well as in the political leadership, I don't think that in the current conditions, where Kashmir has become from a bilateral issue to a trilateral issue, between Ladakh being part of Kashmir over the larger Indian occupied Kashmir, was disputed and was in the General Assembly. Now Ladakh, there's a Chinese claim also on Ladakh. So Kashmir has become very openly a trilateral issue today. And in this environment where India finds itself in a bind, although a more suave, more pragmatic leadership would have tried to calm down at least one front and started talking to Pakistan. But I don't see that happening in near future.
Thank you, sir. Now I hand over the floor to Ambassador Azam Chaudhry. You want to respond to this question?
Yeah, the question Professor Hua had asked was that the composite dialogue which remains suspended, what are the prospects of that reviving, because that will help to lower the tensions and increase the confidence between the two states. I know that this particular aspect has been of critical importance to all nuclear weapon states except India. We had a process called nuclear CBMs as part of the composite dialogue, and the last one was in December of 2012. In fact, I personally led that. So it's been 7.5 years since we have met to discuss even the confidence building. And naturally, this is a big source of concern, anxiety, and worry for the rest of the world, because two contiguous states, both nuclear armed, are not talking about confidence building. Although there are a couple of things that they are continuing to do. They had signed a few agreements relating to nuclear confidence building, and those are being still honored. Personally, I think the resumption, prospects of resumption of composite dialogue are minimal, to say the least. There are two things happening in India. One is that India is going through a convulsion of changing its ideological base from being a democratic pluralistic state to a Hindu Rashtra guided by RSS philosophy. And the second change which is happening is that Prime Minister Modi thinks that South Asia is its area of influence, and it must assert India's hegemony in this area. The international dimension of United States tilting towards India has further encouraged Modi regime to both these transitions that it is making from what India was doing in the past. So I don't think that Prime Minister Modi is yet cognizant of the importance that dialogues have in between two nuclear states. I think they are still stuck, and until or unless they learn their lesson in one way or the other, which could be a hard way, I don't see the prospects of a composite dialogue resumption, and by extension, resumption of the nuclear CBMs.
Last question from the floor. Someone from the floor have asked that if nuclear weapons are not weapon for use, should nuclear capability not to be put to board for commercial and medical use, especially in Pakistan?
So may I answer this question?
Sure, sir.
Thank you very much. I think this is a good question from the floor. Nuclear weapons use, when they are not, God forbid, actually being employed and used, that is the use of the nuclear weapons. That they are used by not employing them, but by relying on the deterrence between the two nuclear weapon states and achieving one's national objectives by the interplay of the deterrence dynamics between the countries. So that is the use of nuclear weapons. They are the political weapons, national weapons, and their possession and their being there with a country is actually the use of nuclear weapons. The main thrust of the question is that there should be, apart from the nuclear weapons, the civilian use of nuclear energy or nuclear capability. A very noble and very effective thought, I think. Pakistan is on the way of the civilian use of nuclear energy in medicine, in agriculture, and other civilianized fields. But of course, like in every department or every aspect, there is a room that Pakistan needs to pay more attention towards the civilian uses of nuclear energy. As India, for example, they have a big infrastructure. The nuclear scientist and technologist infrastructure in India is there, and they are making the use of nuclear energy and nuclear capability in their civilian fields. Pakistan is doing the same, but what we need to do is to expand this sector of the nuclear energy use for the civilian purposes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mujaddid Saab. And thank you all the participants for excellent remarks and comments and response to the questions. Ladies and gentlemen, now we'll come to the final part of our program, including remarks. And before I invite Ambassador Khalid Mahmood, Chairman Board of Governors, Institute of Studies for his concluding remarks, I would like to introduce Ambassador Saab. Ambassador Khalid Mahmood is a former ambassador of Pakistan to Iran, Iraq, China, Saudi Arabia, and Mongolia. He has served as first secretary and later as deputy permanent representative of Pakistan to the United Nations, New York. He has worked as Director General UN, Additional Secretary United Nations, Asia Pacific and Africa, former permanent representative of Pakistan to the Organization of Islamic Conference and the Economic Cooperation Organization. Ambassador Khalid Mahmood Saab, you have the floor, sir.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. It's indeed a great honor for the Institute of Strategic Studies to see some of the best strategic minds, Pakistanis and from China, participating in this webinar. We have indeed learned a lot and feel better informed about the implications for regional stability of the changing Indian nuclear doctrine. As we all know that right of individual and collective self-defense is recognized in the UN Charter, Article 51. And in pursuit of that right, Pakistan has been trying to maintain strategic stability vis-a-vis, I would say, our inveterate enemy state, India. Now, this strategic balance has been not very stable, given the, the size, the resources of India. But a kind of balance was achieved in 1998 when both Pakistan and India went nuclear. But ever since, again, there have been developments which are eroding or have the effect of eroding that strategic balance. Of course, we adopted the minimum credible deterrence and the full spectrum deterrence, all aimed at keeping some balance, here. India, of course, as we all discussed, though it declared its policy of no first use, but its actions, and not its own actions also, but those actions which were encouraged by external powers, they have led to the erosion of that no first use by India. India is, as we know, embarked upon amassing conventional weapons, modernizing its nuclear capability. I don't want to go into details, it will be just a repetition. But the fact remains that its actions are having a very destabilizing impact. And then comes statements from Indian leadership, as was pointed out by Defense Minister and former National Security Advisor Menon, that under certain circumstances, India may not have to stick to this no first use policy. In fact, they have also announced that this will not apply. This restriction will not apply in the face of nuclear and chemical weapons. So my view is that India will continue to harp on this declaratory policy of no first use, but in practice, it will pursue its both modernization of its nuclear capability as well as conventional capability. And then, as Dr. Abhaya was alluding to it, at some stage, if necessary, very seamlessly, move from declaratory no first use policy to first use policy. But that all these developments are indeed very disturbing, and particularly as Ghazala, as you pointed out, in the context, the international context, where all the post-Cold War arms control and regulation mechanisms and agreements, they are crumbling, one by one. And with the given American attitude at this moment, there is no hope that soon the old setup will be restored, if not improved upon. As you know, that this bulletin of atomic scientists, they maintain a doomsday clock, and according to their current reckoning, the clock has moved closer to midnight. It has only 100 seconds now left to midnight. So that is the state of grave situation. And in this situation, not only the big powers among themselves are not, addressing how to minimize or mitigate this danger, but they follow policies which encourage countries like India to further, acquire this capability and force, in fact, Pakistan to follow suit. And what's more, false reports are, spread that Pakistan's nuclear program is the fastest growing program. No, this is completely false. It gives only cover to India to embark upon still greater, nuclear acquisition of nuclear weaponry. And in this, as I said, the foreign powers are equally culprit. 2008, the nuclear deal with India, then followed up by so many programs by so many nuclear exporting, material countries and technology, all this, including Japan, Australia, all jumped on this bandwagon. So the result has been that India has amassed nuclear material, technology, and also having these nuclear power plants running outside the safeguards of IAEA. So if this is the situation, I think we all have to think about it, and responsibility, of course, is on the big powers more, but also on all nuclear and other powers to put a stop to this, slide towards greater anarchy, greater tension. Because at the moment, as I said, it is only 100 seconds to the doomsday midnight clock. And Pakistan has been always acting as a responsible nuclear power. We were not the first to introduce this nuclear weaponry in this subcontinent. We tried our best to having declared this area as non-nuclear weapon-free zone and offering so many aid to India so that we don't take this path. But all our efforts were rebuffed, and the result is where we find ourselves now in this very unenviable position. This is an unenviable position not only for Pakistan, India, but the whole region, and particularly the masses, poor masses of this region, who I think deserve better. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you, Professor Khalid Mahmood. With this concluding remarks, we will come to an end to our webinar, and I totally agree with Ambassador Khalid Mahmood's point of view that we should put a stop to all the hostilities and the tensions. And I also want to conclude on this notion that the best use of nuclear weapons is not to use them. But again, if something is imposed on Pakistan by its adversary India, Pakistan is capable enough to defend itself. With these remarks, we come to an end of our program, and I once again thank you all the participants, starting from Dr. Ghulam Mujaddid, Air Vice Marshal Faiz Ahmad Saab, Dr. Rabi Akhtar, Air Marshal Retired Ashfaq Karai, and special thanks to our professor, Chinese friend, Professor Khan Hua, for joining us today and giving us a very insightful and very informative point of view on these important subjects and issues. So once again, I thank you all. Please stay safe and have a good day ahead. Allah Hafiz.